What's up guys, welcome back to the fourth and final video in this series on Wavy and Glossy Yu-Gi-Oh cards. In this video I'm going to tie up the loose ends from the last part where I talked about the previous theories about what came first. If you haven't done so already, do check out those other three videos first, since they will make it a lot easier to understand what I'm talking about now. Probably the most neglected point in this whole debate about what came first between Wavy and Glossy is the relationship between first edition and unlimited cards in both of those prints. So it's generally assumed that both of those prints are single printings. So all Wavy cards, first edition and unlimited, were printed together, and all Glossy cards, first edition and unlimited, were printed together, both for LOB and for the original starter decks. But this isn't actually the case, and there's some very important evidence to go through for showing that. And the most important card to look at on that front is a common card from LOB, namely Trial of Hell. So what I have here is two first edition North American English copies of this card, which all have the name Trial of Hell. And the one on the left is a glossy print with that high gloss surface. The one on the right is a dull common, which are the commons you pull from Wavy print boxes. So you can see there's less gloss on the surface. And if I flip them over to the back, the colors are darker on the Wavy version, and it also has a more pitted texture on the back than the glossy one. So this card is important because while the first edition copies are all called Trial of Hell, in Unlimited they censored the name to Trial of Nightmare very early on, but there are still a few unlimited copies from the earliest runs called Trial of Hell, and I'll show you that now. So starting with the dull or Wavy commons, I'll bring back that first edition copy with the dull cardstock, and I'll put it alongside two unlimited Trial of Nightmares that I have, both of which have that same dull cardstock on the front and the back. Now I've owned quite a few of these exact cards, the dull cardstock, and the name is always Trial of Nightmare, whereas with the first edition version, the name is always Trial of Hell. And what I'll show you next is a few glossy print Trial of Hells. So first there's the first edition glossy print that I showed you before, but now I'm going to put it alongside a few unlimited versions. You should be able to see that this unlimited Trial of Hell on the left has the same printing style, both front and back, as the first edition one. And it has the name Trial of Hell, as does this third card which I have, which is in pretty bad shape, but you should hopefully still be able to see that it is a glossy print card. So it's very important that Trial of Hell only exists in glossy print and unlimited. And obviously, that'll make you think right away that Glossy came first, because the Wavy version doesn't have that. But again, the important thing is to differentiate between the first edition and the unlimited cards. So while this means that the Glossy Unlimited Trial of Hell came first, that doesn't necessarily carry true of the first edition, and I'm going to demonstrate some more points about that now. So the next point to make, which is coming back to Wavy first edition and unlimited cards, is about the names on ultra rare Wavy print cards. So it's a pretty well-known fact that for first edition Wavy print LOB, the ultra rares often display a lowered name. It can be to a greater or lesser degree, but the name is nearly always at least a little bit lower than you'd expect it to be on a normal card. But for the Wavy Unlimited cards from the starter decks, which are some of the most discussed cards in the whole first print debate, there's actually that pattern does not emerge. So you can see both of these cards have the ultra rare name pretty much exactly where you'd expect it to be, and it's very unusual to see a card from this run with the name any lower than that. So this is another important point, because like with the point about Trial of Hell and Trial of Nightmare, where the first edition cards only have Trial of Hell for Wavy and the unlimited cards only have Trial of Nightmare, and it shows there's a cutoff point between the two. Similarly here, even though these cards are printed on the same cardstock as a Wavy first edition LOB card, you can tell that they're from a separate printing, not just because there's no such thing as a first edition starter deck Kaiba or starter deck Yugi card in Wavy print, but also because they don't display the same print defects that the first edition LOB cards do. So because people have always assumed that the first edition cards were printed together with the unlimited cards, both for Wavy and for Glossy, they ended up missing what is probably the simplest, but also one of the most important points in this whole discussion, which is that first edition cards came before unlimited cards. Now, it sounds too simple to even be relevant to this discussion, but it's actually extremely important because the whole point in first edition cards is that they are the limited production run. And as soon as you take that first edition stamp off and move to unlimited, you cannot move back and print first edition cards. And there is no precedent for that anywhere in the TCG. So it's very important because it means that, for example, this Glossy Unlimited Red Eyes Black Dragon could not have been printed before this Wavy first edition version. And similarly, the Wavy Unlimited version could not have been printed before the Glossy first edition version, because that would go against the very point of it being a first edition card. Now, once you divide Wavy and Glossy into the first edition and unlimited cards separately, the timelines become a little more complicated. So I've drawn out a sheet here which shows the different possible options for first print. So option 1 would be that there is no first print, and so Wavy and Glossy first edition cards were printed together, and then Wavy Unlimited and Glossy Unlimited cards were printed together. But there are a lot of reasons for this not to be correct. So the first one, on the first point of Wavy and Glossy first edition coming together, you would have the issue of explaining why the first edition starter deck cards only exist in Glossy print and not in Wavy as well. Then for the point about Wavy and Glossy Unlimited being printed together, you would have the problem of explaining why in Unlimited, Trial of Hell only exists as a Glossy common, and the Wavy or dull Unlimited common is called Trial of Nightmare. And finally, it's a little bit hard to see why the boxes would have different designs if they were coming out at the same time. So what I mean by that is the Glossy box has a larger first edition font in the bottom right than the Wavy box. So putting everything together, I think it's pretty fair to say that we can cross off option 1 as a realistic option. And option 2 would be where we said that both for the first edition and for the unlimited cards, Glossy came first. So first they printed the Glossy first edition run of LOB, then they printed the Wavy first edition run of LOB, and then they did the same print order for the unlimited, so they started with a Glossy Unlimited printing, and then they moved to the Wavy Unlimited printing. Now this option might look a bit better than the first one, but there are still problems with it. So in particular, if Glossy is the first edition printing and they move to Wavy after that, then it would be very hard to explain why the starter decks exist in Glossy first edition, but not in Wavy first edition. So bearing that in mind, and there's also another piece of evidence which I'm going to show towards the end of this video, it's safe to say that option 2 has also been crossed off. So that just leaves us with the third and final option, which would be that the Wavy first edition cards were the first printing. Then they would be followed by the Glossy first edition cards as the second printing. Then following on from that, they made the Glossy Unlimited cards. And finally, they moved back to Wavy for the last Unlimited run. Now, I should just point out that the Unlimited cards have to be this way round, because obviously in Unlimited you have Trial of Hell for the Glossy print and Trial of Nightmare for the Wavy print. And if we look at this order of printing, it seems a bit strange at first why they would move from first edition Wavy to Glossy and then back from Glossy to Wavy after the Glossy Unlimited run. But I'm going to go into a bit more detail about that now, and I do have one more very important piece of evidence to show that the first editions were almost certainly this way around. So coming on to that now, one of the first things I showed you all in this whole series on Wavy and Glossy Yu-Gi-Oh cards in the first video is also going to be the last thing I show you in this one. And that card is the Wavy Guy the Dragon Champion, which is one of the least well understood cards in the whole print run of LOB. And the reason I have to mention that here is because it's actually extremely relevant to this point about Wavy first edition coming before Glossy first edition. Because for those who don't know, this card was pulled last year from a factory sealed Glossy box by a friend of mine in Japan. And obviously the fact that this card, which is a Wavy print, was pulled from a factory sealed Glossy print box means that the Glossy box that it came from cannot have been sealed before this Wavy version had already been printed. So aside from that, it's very hard to say much about the history of this card and the story behind it, whether it's a test print or just a discarded card from the Wavy sheets because they never used them to make retail boxes. But whatever the case is, it's very good evidence for saying that the Wavy first edition cards were printed before the Glossy first edition cards, or if they overlapped, that they finished being printed first because the starter decks no longer existed in Wavy first edition, and those came after LOB. And before I move on to try to explain why this printing order might be the case, I'm just going to quickly mention 2 points from my last video for those who haven't seen it. So again, if you haven't, I encourage you to go and watch the full thing because that'll definitely be more informative than what I'm going to say now. But the 2 points that I wanted to bring back are firstly the point about the uncut sheets we have of Glossy first edition cards being dated to Feb the 11th, which is less than a month before the release of the game. So as I said in the last video, it's highly unlikely if that's when the Glossy first edition cards were being printed that they would have been readily available and that the printing would have been finished by the time the game came out. Because distribution normally takes at least a couple of months, and they would have had barely 4 weeks to get these to local stores in time for the release. And the final point which I should mention to do with this continuous printing is that Glossy first edition cards themselves are not all one print, so the LOB cards did come first, and the starter deck Yugi cards, which are slightly different, they have foil bleed a lot more on the cards than the LOB first edition. And also, as I showed in the last video, some of them do not display the full level of gloss that you expect from a Glossy first edition LOB card. Those almost certainly came after, and so it again fits into this printing that because Wavy first edition was the earlier first edition run, or at least the first one to be stopped. That's why those don't exist in Wavy print for the starter decks, but the Glossy prints do. So up to this point, in this video, and in this series as a whole, I've tried to avoid speculation as much as I possibly could, and just presented the facts, or at least the empirical evidence that I've been able to gather over the years, which is relevant to this argument. But when we move from discussing what came first to saying why the printing order might be as it is, unfortunately there just are not enough facts available to really stick to that. So it looks a little strange that they would start with this Wavy stock, then they would switch to the Glossy stock, and they would switch to the Wavy stock. But when you think about it, there are actually a lot of reasonable explanations to why this might be the case. So for example, the Wavy run is a lot smaller than the Glossy run in first edition. And when you look at that, one possible explanation is that they started just with whichever provider was giving them this Wavy card stock. And that was their plan, to just stick with this provider. But as the release got closer, they weren't able to fulfill all of the orders that they were getting from local stores, and so they moved to a different provider to make these Glossy boxes to supplement the print run. This also would tie in with the fact, for example, that the Glossy first edition uncut sheets are dated so close to the release, because that shows that they were obviously in a hurry to get all of the product out on time. And another explanation, for example, if that's not correct, could be that they decided that the cardstock that they originally chose was not high enough quality, and they wanted something that looked more similar to the OCG cards, so they switched from Wavy to Glossy. And then maybe they switched back, for example, because the cardstock was too expensive, or just because they decided that they preferred the deal they had with the original provider. So without having any evidence from employees, it's very difficult to say if any of that is correct, if so, which parts of it, etc. But I think it's important to at least mention it because it shows that this printing order, which originally looks counterintuitive, could still be correct. And with that being said, we have more or less reached the end of this video and this whole series on Wavy and Glossy Yu-Gi-Oh cards, because I have now answered all the questions which I set out to. So I've shown what Wavy and Glossy cards are, how to identify them, which sets and editions they exist for, and what the most likely order of printing was. But there are still a few last remarks that I want to make about these cards. So the first one is about the label of first print, which was originally how Wavy cards were described. Now, even though the printing order which I've set out suggests that that is a correct label for them, I would not support that being used moving forward, because even if it's correct for these cards, it's not correct for the unlimited versions, where Wavy is the final printing out of all of them. And furthermore, even if these cards were printed before the Glossy first edition versions, it's pretty safe to say that both were available right around the time of release, if not on release day. Not only because these started being printed before release, but also because we have the order sheets from stores which were able to order either retail or hobby boxes right from the outset of the game. And that really is the last thing that I wanted to say, so that brings this series to a close. Thank you everyone for watching. I hope you enjoyed the videos. I hope you learned a lot from them. And if you did, I'd really appreciate it if you could leave a like, subscribe to the channel, comment something, whatever you're able to do to help the video reach a wider audience. I really appreciate. And of course, if you have anything to say, if you disagree with these things, if you think that I've missed something, please do comment that as well, and I'll do my best to get back and see what I think about anything that you might come up with. And finally, I don't necessarily plan to post videos that regularly, but I do still plan to make some more informational videos about different topics in the TCG, particularly European cards, because I feel like those are very underappreciated and very few people know correct information about them. But if you have anything else you want to see, please put it down below in the comments as well, and I'll either reply to you in the comments or I'll think about making a video series on it if I think that there's enough to talk about. So yeah, that is it, guys. I hope you all have a fantastic day, and for now, this is Schlost signing out.